Everyone thinks they know the story of Casey Anthony, the most hated mom in America. The trial, the lies, the not guilty verdict that made America's jaw drop. But what if I told you you do not know the full story? Forget what you heard on Nancy Grace, on the news, in the headlines, forget everything. This series is not about defending Casey Anthony, it is about bringing justice, true justice, to Caylee Anthony. Because if there is one thing that the Casey Anthony trial taught us, is that the truth is never as simple as it appears to be. For this series, we're going to be taking a look at the main players in the Casey Anthony / Caylee Anthony trial. Today, we are starting off with looking at George Anthony, who is the father of Casey Anthony and also the grandfather of Caylee Anthony, the young girl that was murdered back in 2008. Before getting started, I want to give you guys a little synopsis on the story of Caylee Anthony. So Caylee Anthony was last seen, as reported by the family, on June 16th of 2008. Now, 31 days surpassed between this date and the date of the actual reporting of her being missing, and that was done by her grandmother, also Casey Anthony's mother, Cindy Anthony. Now, if you are familiar with the 911 phone calls that were done during this time, you would know that initially Casey Anthony claimed that her daughter, Caylee Anthony, was kidnapped by her babysitter.
Yeah, I found out my granddaughter has been taken. She has been missing for a month. Her mother finally admitted that she's been missing.
Okay, what is
here now?
Okay, what is the address that you're calling from?
We're talking about a 3-year-old little girl. So my daughter finally admitted that the baby's in the store. I need to find her.
Your daughter admitted that the baby is where?
But the babysitter took her a month ago that my daughter's been looking for. I told you my daughter was missing for a month. I just found her today, but I can't find my granddaughter. And she just admitted to me that she's been trying to find her.
And then as other phone calls, 911 phone calls progress by Cindy Anthony, then you hear that she starts to maybe suspect that her daughter is involved in her being missing. When the police arrived on the scene to investigate this report, they very quickly realized that Casey Anthony actually has a history of pathological lying. Now, the police described their encounters with Casey Anthony, sharing that, of course, they have had people who have maybe misrepresented things during the time that they are investigating a crime, but Casey Anthony went as far as lying to the police that she worked at Universal Studios, and even actually took them to the Universal Studios lot, into the office building, all the way down to the dead end of a hallway. That is when Casey Anthony finally admitted that, hey, I actually do not work here and I haven't worked here in the past couple years. So even the police was very astonished by the fact that Casey Anthony was willing to lie to that degree. And it was at that moment that they then arrested Casey in relation to the disappearance of her daughter. Now, a lot of you guys are probably very familiar with what Casey Anthony did during those 31 days. She got a back tattoo. She also went clubbing on the Fridays in the weeks while her daughter was reportedly missing, or as she reported at the time, was kidnapped by the nanny. Now, Caylee Anthony's body is eventually found just 10 houses away from the Anthony residence, which is only about a mile away from the Anthony home. And from that moment on, we watch the rest unfold during the Casey Anthony trial. What I find super interesting about this case is the fact that the public has felt so strongly that Casey Anthony killed her own daughter, yet the jury did not side with that. So again, this video is not going to be about me defending Casey Anthony, but I personally have always been curious in those kinds of situations when you have a jury that decides something that is so counter what public opinion is, how exactly did they reach that verdict? We are going to get into all those details in today's video. But before diving into the video, thank you guys to my YouTube fan. I want to say a little shout out because I heard you guys' comments. As you guys can see, I have a new setup here that I'm very excited about for YouTube. So if you guys like this new setup, please let me know in the comments. All right, so let's kick off our video and talk about George Anthony. As I mentioned, he is the father of Casey Anthony and the grandfather of Caylee Anthony. Now, one of the key questions about George Anthony is what is his level of involvement in the disappearance of his granddaughter, Caylee Anthony? Now, if you ask Nancy Grace, she would tell you that George Anthony is just this amazing grandfather who misses his granddaughter and basically sought justice to put his own daughter away for the disappearance of his granddaughter. However, as we start to unpack the actual trial, his testimonies, we then get a very different picture of George Anthony. Before the trial began, George Anthony would appear on various different talk shows and describe that his daughter is innocent. This is also something that he shared with Casey Anthony when he would visit her in jail and let her know that, hey, we're doing everything that we can to actually find justice for you.
When you get out, and Caylee's with us, we're going to be more proactive finding missing children, no matter who.
What is remarkably odd about this is that George Anthony was the state's key witness in the disappearance of Caylee Anthony and the murder of Caylee Anthony. So imagine Casey Anthony surprised when her father is constantly telling her in her jail that, hey, we're doing the best that we can for you. We're going to get justice for you. And then she appears at the first day of the courtroom and she sees that her own father is actually testifying with the prosecution against her. Now, the other important thing is that Casey Anthony was being tried for a first-degree murder charge. And while many people feel like this is the right charge against her, George Anthony, as he was appearing on those various different interviews, basically did not feel like that was the case. And even if you see interviews of him after the trial, he does believe that Casey Anthony might have murdered her daughter, but as an accident.
Is she a killer?
Do you think she intentionally wanted to kill Caylee?
I don't think she intentionally wanted to.
Okay,
I don't think she intentionally wanted to, but she should be in jail because of Caylee not being here.
And what was on the table for Casey Anthony's trial? The death penalty. Isn't that remarkably odd that you would believe as a parent that your daughter accidentally murdered her granddaughter or her own daughter, yet you feel as though the right punishment is the death penalty for her? Now, this is actually something that we can corroborate with the Anthony's appearance on a reality TV show where they're talking to the interviewer, and George Anthony shares that Jeff Ashton shared with him before the trial that the death penalty was on the line for his daughter. So, like I said, he knew that the death penalty was on the line for his daughter, and yet he still chose to testify.
Out to get her.
George, people have a hard time with this. Why did you testify before the grand jury?
Because I believe my daughter should have been put in jail. I was hoping so. Yeah, absolutely, I was.
Hoping so.
That's right. One of the prosecutors, he says, you know, George, he says, based on what we have right now, your daughter is facing either death or she could be in jail for the rest of her life. That hit me like a ton of bricks.
And was that before you testified or after you testified?
That was before.
Now, the other thing that I want to bring your attention to is George Anthony's testimony during the trial. So his timeline of events on the last day that he saw his granddaughter, Caylee Anthony, was that he remembered everything up to what she was wearing, including the backpack that she was wearing. But when he is prodded a little bit further about whether he remembers what his wife wore that day, or if he remembers what his wife wore the week before, he's not able to answer that question. Now,
what Caylee was wearing that day.
Yes.
Okay. And that was a pink top?
Mm-hmm.
Is that a yes?
Yes.
And jean shorts?
Yes.
And white sunglasses?
She had white sunglasses. Yes.
And a backpack with monkeys on it. Is that correct?
When I first was asked the question by the state, I just said a backpack, but yeah, it did have what I believe was a monkey design on it, yes.
What did Cindy wear that day?
I have no idea. I can't remember what Cindy wore that morning because Cindy would leave sometime between 7, 8 o'clock in the morning.
What's
I mean,
Cindy
she was very professional wearing it. Could have been a pair of slacks and a top. I don't know. I couldn't tell you.
What did Cindy wear the next day?
Overall as to that question.
What did Cindy wear the next day?
Again, it could have been slacks. It could have been a dress, a nice top. I don't know. I don't know what Cindy wore the next day.
Now, you weren't asked about what Caylee was wearing for 1 month after she went missing, correct?
You're going to have to give me a little.
I'm not going to say that just because there is a discrepancy there that he is automatically guilty, because that is also his granddaughter. So it's obvious that he probably had a little bit of a better attention with his granddaughter versus his wife. But what I do think is remarkable is his recollection of the actual timeline of the day that he last saw his granddaughter on June 16th. Now, according to George Anthony's testimony, he assisted Casey Anthony with putting Caylee Anthony in the car, walking her to the car, strapping her in her seatbelt, and then seeing them off. And then later, a couple hours later, he then went to work himself. However, what we are able to see from the different phone records and computer records of the Anthony residence is that Casey Anthony remained in the home after George Anthony had left for work. According to George Anthony's testimony, at 12:50, he saw Casey Anthony out with Caylee Anthony, and that was the last time that he saw her.
After you had breakfast with Caylee, what did Caylee do then?
Oh, we watched a DVD. I'm almost positive we did. As far as which one, I can't remember specifically. But just spending time with her, coloring a coloring book was something we did pretty much an everyday occurrence.
And
Just spending time with her.
And it's your testimony that both Casey and Caylee left the house at 12:50.
12:50 or shortly thereafter, yes, sir, positive. I know that for a fact.
And what time did you go to work at that day?
Shortly after 2 o'clock, 2:10, 2:15. I only had about a 10-minute drive to go to work, and I just lived a short distance. I worked a short distance away.
However, I'm going to show you guys the Casey Anthony phone records, and we could see that there's actually interaction all the way from 1 p.m. We could see some phone calls at 2 p.m., 3 p.m., all the way up until 4 p.m. And as you guys should be able to see, you can see the latitude and longitude represented there, which represents a vicinity that is very close to the Anthony family residency. So if you guys are not super familiar with how those phone towers ping, oftentimes if one particular tower is busy, they will swap you over to another one. So just because you guys are seeing that there are kind of two locations there, it doesn't mean that she's actually physically moving. It just means that maybe that phone service is going to ping to another tower that offers the service a little bit more optimized. Now, if that isn't enough to convince you that Casey Anthony remained in the home after George Anthony, we also have access to are the internet records of the Anthony family computer. As you guys can see, we have from 11 a.m. We also have activity at 2 p.m. all on June 16th of 2008. So we know that Casey Anthony, in fact, did not leave before George Anthony was in the home because George Anthony said that she left at 12:50. Another search that was later unsealed by the court documents was this search of foolproof suffocation. Now, this search came in at 2:51 on the Anthony family computer, and this search directed the user to a site that showed ideas for suicide. Now, according to George Anthony's original testimony, he left the home at 12:30 that day. And according to his testimony, it is only a 10-minute drive from his home to his workplace. We also know from his workplace stamps that he actually got to work at 3:01 p.m. that day. So there actually is about a 31-minute gap if we are to take his original testimony at face value and say, yes, he actually did leave at that time. We also know from Casey Anthony's phone records that George Anthony called her at 3:02 p.m. that day. So that would just be 1 minute after he arrived at his workplace. Now, why is this significant? Like I said, at 2:51, we have this search of foolproof suffocation. We don't yet know if Casey Anthony was in fact the person to search this term up. I want to suggest that it is possible, even though it seems most likely that it was Casey Anthony that searched this, it is possible that George Anthony could have searched this term and then driven to work and still arrive to work within the 10 minutes that it takes to get from his home to his workplace, and then also call Casey Anthony 1 minute after that. But regardless, if you feel as though George Anthony was one to search this term, we at least know that during his testimony, he actively lied about his position in the home, Casey's position in the home, and the timing of those events. And I want to make a point about this because the prosecution also knew that he was lying. They had access to Casey Anthony's phone records, they had preliminary access to George Anthony's phone records, and none of them were willing to contest this time because it worked actually in both of their favors. If George had last seen Casey and Caylee leave the home, then the prosecution can say that Casey Anthony took her daughter and killed her somewhere else. What this ultimately shows was that both the defense and the prosecution were willing to ignore these details for their own good. The prosecution was not going to throw away this key witness of George Anthony because their goal was to nail this on Casey Anthony. And I think that in the end, Caylee Anthony never received justice from either side, both prosecution and also the defense. Now, according to Casey Anthony, she alleged that her father molested her when she was a young girl and that he was potentially doing that to Caylee Anthony. And this came out via Jose Baez, who was serving as Casey Anthony's attorney during the trial. Now, I'm a little bit on the fence for this accusation. I'll give you both reasons as to why I think it could be true and why I think it could not be true. So first, why I think it could not be true is because during the time that Casey Anthony was awaiting trial, she was in solitary confinement, and she even shared for herself that she had this point of realization while she was in solitary confinement, while she was writing in her diary. So, of course, solitary confinement is not for the faint of heart. You can begin to maybe hallucinate while you're in solitary confinement. Also, when she saw her father was serving as a key witness against her, she probably did want to have some way to undermine what he was saying on the witness stand. However, the very cynical part of me that thinks that there could be a possibility of this is because one testimony or a couple of testimonies where George Anthony and actually Cindy Anthony talk about Casey Anthony and how she initially got pregnant.
The happiness multiplied after then 18-year-old Casey became pregnant. How did you find out Casey was pregnant?
She says, I just came from the doctors and I've got something to tell you. And she says, Mom, I'm pregnant. And I looked at her and her face, you know, she was smiling, and I said, that's awesome.
Was she excited? Was she nervous?
No, she was excited.
It was a happy moment.
It was a
It was a very happy moment to know that you're going to be a grandparent.
So for those of you guys who do not know, Casey Anthony was a teen mom. She was only 18 years old when she initially got pregnant and eventually had her daughter, Caylee Anthony, at 19 years old. Now, according to the testimony of George Anthony, the family was elated at the fact that they were going to have a granddaughter. And they were so elated that they didn't even really ask Casey Anthony who the father was.
Now, you mentioned that you were in the delivery room. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you assisted in the delivery?
No, I did not assist. I was there and observed my granddaughter being delivered.
And you didn't know who the father was up until that day?
No, I did not. Did not know that.
You didn't ask?
Not up to that point I didn't, because when I found out that I was going to be a grandfather, Casey was expecting a child, and we went through the different tests, and we went...
My question to you, sir, is did you ask?
I think it was shortly thereafter, or right around, maybe just before she had delivery. I'm not sure of the exact time when I finally did ask. And I remember a name of Baker was brought up.
So the answer is yes, you did ask.
Yes.
Now, how soon after finding out that your only daughter is pregnant did you ask? Who's the father?
I don't know. It could have been, like I said, just prior to her delivering Caylee.
So
I'm not really sure. I don't have an exact timetable. You're asking me to be specific.
Just a second.
Now, this strikes me as remarkably odd because as a young mother, as a teenage mother, her parents would not be interested in who the father was of their granddaughter. The other thing that came out actually in Casey Anthony's documentary was this concept of being a pathological liar having to have some root in trauma. Now, I actually have seen that both advocates for Casey Anthony and against Casey Anthony do believe that the way that she is able to lie is probably a result of some childhood trauma that she has faced. Now, I don't know if the trauma is a sexual related trauma, physical, verbal, whatever it is, but I do think that there is something to be said about the fact that Casey Anthony does have this pathological lying personality trait that seems to be rooted in something. All right, now I want to walk you guys through another claim that came out during George Anthony's testimony, which is the testimony of smelling human decomposition inside of Casey Anthony's car. So, like I mentioned, when Casey Anthony originally left the home, she was gone for a total of 31 days. Now, towards the tail end of those 31 days, the family actually picked up Casey Anthony's car after she ran out of gas. She left it at a local gas station, and then it ended up getting towed away to a tow yard. From that tow yard, George Anthony actually went himself, picked up the car, and then brought it back home. And that's what started the search by Cindy Anthony and George Anthony to find their daughter, because they were like, wait, this is odd. She's been gone for 31 days. We haven't seen her. We haven't heard from our granddaughter. But keep in mind, Casey Anthony and Caylee Anthony lived with George and Cindy Anthony. So for them to be gone for such a long stretch of time was odd for them. Eventually, at some point, they were going to have questions, and those questions just happened to come around the day 31 mark. However, it was only during the trial that George Anthony insisted at the fact that he smelled human decomposition.
I was very concerned about the odor. I had smelled something like that some years prior, and I was concerned.
What thought went through your mind?
That particular smell, whenever you smell it, it's something you never forget. It's a very distinct odor.
But was there a concern that came into your mind as you smelled that odor? Maybe I should be more specific.
My mind did race somewhat to the point because I hadn't seen my daughter or my granddaughter for some time. I did worry that, I did worry about for my daughter or my granddaughter, or both at the same time.
Did you have a thought that they might be in the trunk or in the car, dead?
I was hoping that wasn't the case. I was hoping that everything was okay. I didn't want to believe what I was smelling to a point. I was trying to not think too much ahead of myself.
The odor that you were testifying a moment ago that this reminded you of from your past, was that the odor of a human corpse?
Yes.
Apparently, he did make some remark to the tow yard employee, but really didn't share that with anybody else until the trial. Now, I find that to be incredibly suspicious because George Anthony actually is a former police officer. He was a former investigator. So even on trial during his testimony, he said that it was a smell that you never forget. Human decomposition is a smell that you never forget. So for the fact that George Anthony smelled the quote-unquote human decomposition on Casey Anthony's car, but did not he himself call the police and report his daughter and granddaughter missing, it was actually only until the next day that Cindy Anthony reported his daughter missing.
Have you testified that as a police officer, you smelled that smell before?
Yes, sir, I have.
And you testified under direct examination that you didn't touch the bag.
I did not touch that garbage bag at all.
Because you know better than to touch any potential evidence.
I didn't know it would be evidence at this time.
And at that point, when you have been telling Mr. Birch about your missing granddaughter, and you haven't seen your daughter in almost 3 weeks or spoken to her, and you smell that smell in that car, is that when you called 911?
I never called 911.
A young woman that you have, your child, is missing, correct?
My daughter, I didn't know where my daughter was at on that date.
And you're smelling her car that smells like a dead body, and you don't call the police.
No, sir, I did not.
And you don't call your daughter to see if she's okay.
I didn't call my daughter at that time.
And you don't call your daughter to see if Caylee's okay.
I didn't call my daughter to inquire about her or Caylee at that time. I did not.
And as a detective, you know that if you smell a dead body in a car, that's a potential crime scene.
At the time, sir, I wasn't a detective. I am just a father and a grandfather.
As a former detective, as a father, a grandfather, a human being, you're intelligent enough to know that if you smell human decomposition in a car and you have people in your life that are missing, you call the police, don't you, sir?
Argumentative.
I will also say this, that during the time they were initially investigating Caylee Anthony's disappearance, a bunch of police officers were going in and out of the Anthony home, and none of them mentioned any sense of human decomposition in the car. Now, it is known that there were trash bags of food that were left inside of Casey Anthony's car, and on a hot summer day, obviously those foods are going to smell, and if she left them there for a long period of time, the car was towed, those things are going to smell eventually and reek. And people did cite that it smelled horribly. Even in Cindy Anthony's 911 phone call, she said that the car smelled horribly. However, it was only on the witness stand that George Anthony was claiming that the smell that he smelled was human decomposition. Again, I want to remind you that George Anthony was not the person to make the 911 phone call, nor was he even the person to pull in his wife and try to figure the situation out. He went back to work that day after picking up Casey Anthony's car. He also claimed in the trial that he was worried at that point where his daughter and his granddaughter were, but again, none of his behavior was consistent with that worry. He never called Caylee, he never called 911, he never did any of those things that you would think are normal for someone who is genuinely worried about where their daughter is. Now, I want to talk a little bit about George Anthony's character. So one bombshell eyewitness testimony came from a woman by the name of Crystal Holloway. Now, Crystal Holloway was actually the mistress of George Anthony, and he met Crystal during one of those light ceremonies for Caylee. So while this trial was going on, George Anthony was having an affair with this woman. Now, do not be confused. This woman had no reason to put herself out there like that, except for the fact that George Anthony actually told her something during one of their encounters in relation to Caylee Anthony.
I didn't think that he could raise somebody that was capable of harming her child. And that's when he said it was an accident that snowballed out of control. But I was caught off guard with it, and by the time I looked up, he had tears in his eyes, and I didn't say anything after that.
Crystal Holloway also was having an affair in her marriage, and George Anthony clearly was having an affair against Cindy Anthony in his marriage. So she putting herself out there like that was definitely not in any way her trying to claim fame. It was during one encounter that they had where George Anthony seemingly confessed to her that there was an accident with Caylee and that it snowballed out of control. George Anthony stating that this was potentially an accident is significant because both Cindy Anthony and Lee Anthony, who is the brother of Casey Anthony, who I haven't talked about yet, but they both claimed that when they were younger, George Anthony would take their pets and as a form of burial, they would wrap them in the pet's favorite blanket and then put them in trash bags. And as sad as it sounds, Caylee Anthony was actually found this exact same way. Another thing that came out during George Anthony's testimony was that he actually was having some marital issues with Cindy Anthony. They were having both personal issues and also financial issues. When it came down to talking about the financial issues, he basically shared that he was having a gambling addiction and also he was a victim of a Nigerian bank scam.
There was a Nigerian bank scam and also some minor gambling that was done on it. So, I mean, I didn't lie to them. I told them the truth. I'm telling you the truth today.
So it's both.
Now, I do not know about you, but in my mind, you either have to be very young and innocent, an older person who's also very innocent, or just a complete buffoon to fall for a Nigerian bank scam. I mean, there are literally typos throughout an entire email, and for them to get to a point where they're actually stealing money from you, I'm sorry, George Anthony, but as a former police officer too, that you're falling for something like this. Now, I'm not saying that because he fell for a Nigerian bank scam, he's automatically involved and implicated in the death of his granddaughter, but I'm just saying that these are very questionable things to fall for. Now, I do want to point out that the defense did claim that George Anthony assisted with the disposing of Caylee Anthony's body, and based off of what we talked about today, it does seem like maybe that there is a possibility, at least we know for sure, that George Anthony on the stand was caught lying various different times, but not even really caught because, like I said, the prosecution nor the defense had any desire to catch him in any lies. They were just going with his story. Whatever the story he was telling, they were going with it because they wanted to either see their client win or they wanted to see Casey Anthony behind bars. Again, they did not really truly, in my opinion, seek real justice for Caylee Anthony. Now, I want to highlight a quick couple points in relation to George Anthony. One is he did have a car accident, and as a result of this car accident, he appeared on Dr. Oz and shared that he wishes to be forgiven in a general sense for his family, for Casey Anthony, and it definitely draws some questions like what would you possibly be forgiven for if you did not do anything? There was also an attempted suicide in January of 2009. Now, I'm not saying that him attempting suicide is not a form of maybe grief, but I am saying it definitely is another interesting point in the fact that his granddaughter was missing 6 months prior to that, and then he is now committing suicide. And this is just 1 month after Caylee's body is found. Now, I want to leave you with one final thought, which is an interview that George Anthony gave on Crime Watch. And as part of this interview, he shared that if Casey Anthony were to try to monetize anything in relation to Caylee Anthony, he would file a wrongful death lawsuit against her.
Are you considering a civil lawsuit, a wrongful death lawsuit against your daughter to finally get at the truth or assign some responsibility?
If it gets to the point that my daughter would sell her story and that she would want to talk about it and get paid, yes.
you would file a lawsuit?
Oh, absolutely, I would. Absolutely.
Well, George, it is time to wake up because Casey Anthony has made her appearance on both Substack and on TikToks, and both of these platforms do support monetization. So it is time to file that lawsuit if you are serious about it. But in my opinion, I do not think that he will, because I think that he probably is more involved than the public thinks. And right now, he is coasting on the fact that everybody just thinks that he is this very great grandfather that fought for his granddaughter's justice. With that being said, I want to hear what you guys think about George Anthony. For the next episode in this series, we are going to be looking into Cindy Anthony, and then we're going to be closing off with Casey Anthony. So stay tuned, and thank you guys so much for watching this episode. I will talk to you guys soon. Bye.